England after 1066, Norman Conquest and the end of Anglo-Saxon rule. The year is 1071. Norman soldiers advance across a narrow causeway towards the Isle of Ely, their horses nervous, their armor heavy. Ahead, the marshes stretch endlessly, water, reeds, and mud. Somewhere in that landscape waits a man they've been hunting for months. His name is Hereward the Wake. 5 years after the Battle of Hastings, England has fallen. The old nobility are dead, exiled, or broken. Norman castles dominate the countryside. Rebellion has been crushed everywhere it appeared. Everywhere except here. This is the story of the last English rebel. A minor landowner who refused to accept that the conquest was complete. A man who turned England's most treacherous landscape into a weapon. And a figure who vanished so completely that we still don't know whether he died fighting, made peace, or simply disappeared. Nearly 1,000 years later, his name survives, not because he won, but because he wouldn't stop. Who was Hereward the Wake? Origins of England's last Anglo-Saxon rebel. Hereward the Wake appears in the historical record like a ghost. No birth certificate. No contemporary biography. What survives is fragmentary, brief notices in chronicles, land records, and one extended narrative written decades after the events it describes. Here's what we can establish with confidence. Hereward was not a great earl or a royal claimant. He was a minor landowner with estates in eastern England, around what is now Lincolnshire and the Fenlands. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, records lands that almost certainly once belonged to him, now transferred to Norman hands. That transfer tells us something crucial: Hereward lost real property as a direct result of the Norman conquest. This wasn't abstract politics. This was personal. Later sources claim he was exiled before 1066, possibly during the reign of Edward the Confessor. The reasons given are vague: disobedience, violence, disorderly behavior. If true, this would place him amongst a class of men already marginalized before the Normans arrived. According to the Gesta Herewardi, our main narrative source, exile took Hereward to Flanders, where he fought as a mercenary. This is plausible. Flanders was a center of military activity, and English exiles did fine service there. Whether the specific exploits described are his, or borrowed from familiar heroic patterns, we cannot say. What matters is what he returned to. An England transformed. Norman lords in possession of English estates. English families displaced. In some accounts, members of Hereward's own family killed. Whether every detail is accurate, the pattern is consistent with what we know. The Norman conquest wasn't just a change of rulers. It was a systematic replacement of the English elite. At this point, Hereward becomes visible as something new, a rebel. Not a claimant to the throne. Not a regional magnate defending inherited privilege. But a local leader organizing resistance in the one landscape where resistance was still possible. The Fenlands. The Fenlands of East Anglia, how geography enabled resistance. Before large-scale drainage in the early modern period, the Fenlands of eastern England formed one of the most distinctive environments in the country. This wasn't open countryside. It was a shifting world of marsh, reed bed, shallow lakes, tidal rivers, and narrow causeways. Solid ground existed, but it was fragmented and often temporary. Routes that were safe one season could vanish the next. For locals, this landscape was familiar and productive. Fish, eels, birds, and grazing supported communities who'd lived there for generations. For outsiders, especially heavily armed cavalry, it was lethal. Horses bogged down. Armor became a liability. Large formations were impossible to maneuver. The very things that made Norman power effective elsewhere became disadvantages here. And Norman power rested entirely on those things. The conquest had been achieved through disciplined cavalry, fortified positions, and rapid projection of force. Castles were its physical expression. But castles could only dominate territory that could be reached, supplied, and patrolled. The Fenlands resisted that logic. Hereward's rebellion was shaped by this reality. It didn't rely on holding territory in the conventional sense. Instead, it depended on movement, concealment, and selective violence. Small groups could strike Norman targets, patrols, estates, isolated officials, then disappear into terrain that neutralized pursuit. This wasn't romantic. It was practical resistance born of geography. The Fenlands offered something else as well: uncertainty. Norman authority was strongest where it could be seen and enforced. In the marshes, that authority became intermittent. Law, taxation, military presence, all thinned out. This created space for rebellion to survive even after it had failed elsewhere. Norman chroniclers consistently describe the region as treacherous and unnatural, a place that resisted order itself. English sources treat it as a refuge, a landscape that protected those who knew how to read it. These competing descriptions reflect more than geography. They reflect competing claims to legitimacy. By operating from the Fenlands, Hereward wasn't just evading Norman power. He was exposing its limits. And that mattered more than any single raid. It suggested that conquest was incomplete, not everywhere, not always. The Ely Rebellion explained England's last major revolt against Norman rule. By 1070, organized resistance to Norman rule had been pushed to the edges of England. Earlier revolts in the north and west had been crushed with extreme violence. The harrying of the north had devastated entire regions. Castles dominated the landscape. Most English nobles had either submitted, fled abroad, or been removed entirely. Ely was different. The Isle of Ely rose above the surrounding marshes as a natural stronghold. In the 11th century, it wasn't connected to the mainland by permanent roads, but by narrow, shifting causeways known only to those who lived and worked in the region. Waterways provided food, transport, and escape. For the Normans, Ely was difficult to reach and harder to control. This made it an obvious focal point for resistance. English rebels gathered there alongside displaced nobles and local supporters. Monks at Ely Abbey played a central role, not only as landholders but as organizers and suppliers. Their estates provided resources, and their knowledge of the terrain was indispensable. The rebellion wasn't chaotic. It was structured around a defensible position with leadership and purpose. Hereward emerged as one of the key figures. He wasn't the only leader, but he was closely associated with the practical defense of Ely and the use of the surrounding Fenlands for attack and retreat. His experience and local knowledge gave him influence disproportionate to his formal status. Then something happened that transformed the situation entirely. Danish forces arrived. Danish fleets had previously played decisive roles in English politics. Their presence raised the possibility, however brief, that Norman control might be seriously challenged. For William the Conqueror, this transformed Ely from a local disturbance into a strategic threat. The rebellion mattered not because it was likely to succeed, but because it persisted. It demonstrated that Norman authority wasn't yet absolute. As long as Ely held, the conquest remained incomplete in practice, even if it was settled in law. That was something William could not tolerate. William the Conqueror's response: how the Ely Rebellion was suppressed. William the Conqueror did not approach Ely as a conventional battlefield. By 1070, Norman control over England depended not just on military dominance, but on perception. Ely's survival suggested limits to Norman authority, and those limits were dangerous. William chose to act directly, but not hastily. Cavalry was ineffective in the marshes. Rapid assault risked failure. Instead, the response was slow, deliberate, and resource-intensive. Norman forces attempted to impose order on the landscape itself. Causeways were strengthened. Temporary bridges were constructed across the wetlands. Timber, earthworks, and floating supports were used to force access where none naturally existed. Contemporary accounts describe repeated failures. Structures collapsing under the weight of armored men. Troops bogged down in water and mud. Progress measured in small, costly advances. This was warfare by persistence rather than maneuver. At the same time, William applied pressure beyond the battlefield. The lands surrounding Ely, much of them controlled by the abbey, were vulnerable to confiscation. Monastic communities stood to lose not only their property but their political standing if the rebellion continued. Negotiation, coercion, and threat worked alongside military effort. The imbalance of resources was decisive. The rebels depended on local support and limited supplies. William commanded the revenues of a conquered kingdom. Time favored him. When access to Ely was finally achieved, resistance collapsed quickly. Some rebel leaders were captured and punished severely. Others vanished from the record. The rebellion ceased to exist as an organized force. What the Norman response demonstrated wasn't just military superiority, but administrative endurance. Ely fell not because its defenders were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer resist the sustained application of power from a regime that could afford to wait. For William, the suppression of Ely removed the last serious challenge to Norman rule in England. For Hereward, it marked the point at which resistance could survive only by disappearance. What happened to Hereward the Wake? Escape, betrayal, and disappearance. The fall of Ely did not bring closure. It brought uncertainty. When Norman forces finally gained access to the island, the organized rebellion ended quickly. Leaders who could be identified were captured and punished. Lands were confiscated. Authority was reasserted. But the central figure associated with the rebellion did not share that fate. Hereward escaped. How he did so is one of the most disputed questions in the entire story. The sources offer multiple, conflicting accounts, none of which can be verified with confidence. Some versions suggest betrayal. Monks or local informants are said to have revealed routes through the marshes in exchange for protection or reward. This wouldn't be unusual. Monastic communities were deeply vulnerable to Norman reprisals, and their priorities didn't always align with those of armed rebels. Other accounts emphasize Hereward's ability to evade capture even at the moment of collapse. He's described slipping away before the Normans fully closed their grip, retreating into territory where organized resistance was no longer possible but individual survival still was. From this point onwards, the historical record fragments almost completely. One tradition claims Hereward continued guerrilla resistance elsewhere, operating on a smaller scale without the support base Ely had provided. Another suggests negotiation, that he eventually came to terms with William, accepted a pardon, and recovered some portion of his lands. A third insists he was hunted down and killed, bringing the story to a violent end. Each version serves a different purpose. Continued resistance preserves the image of defiance. Pardon and reconciliation allow for closure and legitimacy. Death in pursuit satisfies the expectations of a tragic rebel narrative. What they share is a lack of evidence. No contemporary document records Hereward's capture, execution, or settlement. There's no charter, no legal confirmation, no clear notice of his death. For a figure associated with such persistent trouble, that silence is striking. The disappearance itself became part of the story. It allowed Hereward to exist in a space between defeat and survival, where legend could grow without being constrained by fact. Unlike other rebel leaders whose ends were publicly recorded, Hereward simply fades from view. That absence isn't accidental. It reflects both the limitations of the sources and the way memory works in defeated societies. What cannot be confirmed is left open, and what is left open is reshaped. Hereward the Wake, Myth versus Reality and the Medieval Sources. By the time Hereward disappears from the historical record, the problem facing any modern account becomes clear. Almost everything that survives beyond this point comes not from contemporary documentation, but from later narrative construction. The central text is the Gesta Herewardi. It was written decades after the events it describes, probably in the early 12th century, almost certainly within a monastic context. The author wasn't an eyewitness. Parts of the work appear to have been reconstructed from oral tradition, others adapted from written material now lost. The result is a hybrid source, neither pure fiction nor reliable chronicle. The Gesta contains material that aligns closely with what we can verify. It places Hereward in the Fenlands. It associates him with the rebellion at Ely. It reflects the political realities of post-conquest England, dispossession, exile, the collapse of English lordship. Alongside them, however, are episodes that follow recognizable legendary patterns. Disguises, improbable infiltrations, feats of strength, narrowly avoided capture, encounters that verge on the supernatural. These aren't random embellishments. They belong to a well-established medieval tradition of heroic storytelling. That doesn't mean the author was inventing freely. Medieval writers didn't draw a sharp line between history and moral narrative in the modern sense. Their purpose was often explanatory rather than documentary. A story could be considered true if it expressed a deeper meaning about character, loyalty, or justice, even if the details were uncertain. This matters because later readers often treat the Gesta as biography rather than a constructed text. When that happens, legend hardens into fact. What emerges is a layered figure. At the core is a historical rebel, a minor English landowner who resisted Norman rule and played a significant role in the Ely Rebellion. Around that core grew a narrative shaped by memory, trauma, and the needs of later generations. The more distant the events became, the easier it was to smooth contradictions and heighten drama. Even his epithet, the Wake, possibly meaning the watchful, may be a later addition, retrofitted to a figure already half legendary. By the time Hereward steps fully into legend, he's already both man and symbol. From rebel to legend, how Hereward the Wake became a folk hero. Once Hereward passed out of the contemporary record, control of his story passed to others. The earliest stages of that process were monastic. Communities that had lived through the upheaval of the Norman conquest were left to interpret defeat after the fact. For English monasteries, this meant reconciling survival under Norman rule with memories of resistance. Figures like Hereward offered a way to do both. He could be remembered as defiant without threatening the new political order, because his rebellion had already failed. The Gesta Herewardi didn't simply preserve memories, it organized them. It selected episodes that emphasized courage, cunning, and endurance. It downplayed ambiguity where possible and framed resistance as morally justified even when unsuccessful. In doing so, it transformed a local rebel into a representative figure. Over time, this version of Hereward hardened. As England moved further away from the events of the conquest, fewer readers had any direct connection to what had happened in the Fenlands. The rebellion at Ely ceased to be a political problem and became a story. That transition allowed embellishment to accumulate without challenge. Centuries later, the process repeated itself in a different form. In the 19th century, Hereward was rediscovered and reshaped for a new audience. Victorian writers approached the Norman conquest through the lens of national character and moral struggle. Anglo-Saxon England was presented as freer, more virtuous, and more English than what followed. In this framework, Hereward became an ideal symbol. The most influential reworking came from Charles Kingsley, whose novel Hereward the Wake recast him as the last of the English. Kingsley's Hereward is less a historical figure than a moral type, proud, independent, fundamentally opposed to foreign domination. This version proved durable. It aligned neatly with Victorian ideas about progress, identity, and resistance. It also resolved the problem of defeat by turning failure into virtue. Hereward didn't need to win. His refusal to submit was enough. What's striking is how little this later image depends on evidence. By the time Hereward entered popular consciousness, the historical uncertainties no longer mattered. The legend had achieved independence from the record. The last English rebel, why Hereward the Wake still matters. Hereward the Wake matters because his story sits at a point where evidence thins and memory takes over. What can be established is limited but clear. He was a real individual, active in eastern England after the Norman Conquest. He was associated with resistance in the Fenlands and played a significant role in the rebellion centered on the Isle of Ely. He opposed Norman authority at a moment when most organized resistance had already collapsed. What cannot be established is equally important. There's no contemporary narrative written during his lifetime. There's no reliable account of his fate. The sources that survive were written later, shaped by oral tradition, monastic interests, and the expectations of storytelling. This combination isn't unusual in the aftermath of conquest. Victors leave documents, the defeated leave fragments. When resistance fails, it's remembered indirectly, through stories that adapt over time to make sense of loss. Calling him the last Anglo-Saxon rebel doesn't mean he was the final Englishman to resist Norman rule. It marks something more specific. After Ely, opposition no longer took the form of organized rebellion that could plausibly challenge the new regime. What followed was adaptation, negotiation, and gradual accommodation. Hereward stands at the point where resistance passed from political reality into historical memory. The gaps in the record aren't problems to be solved but conditions to be understood. They show how conquest reshapes not only power but remembrance. Figures like Hereward endure not because their actions are fully known, but because they provide a way to acknowledge resistance without reopening conflict. In the end, Hereward the Wake is important not because he won, or because his story can be neatly resolved. He's important because his rebellion failed, his fate remained unclear, and his memory persisted. Through him, the aftermath of the Norman conquest can be seen not as a single decisive moment, but as a long process of adjustment, loss, and reinterpretation. And perhaps that's the point. In the marshes of eastern England, one man refused to accept that England's story was finished. Nearly 1,000 years later, we're still trying to work out what happened to him. That uncertainty, that unresolved question, is itself a form of resistance. Conclusion. If you'd like to go deeper into Hereward the Wake and the sources behind his story, I've linked a book in the description that I found particularly useful whilst researching this video. If you're interested in more long-form history like this, focused on evidence, uncertainty, and how stories are formed, you can subscribe to the channel. Future videos follow the same approach, looking at figures and events where the boundary between history and memory isn't always clear. If you think this video might be useful to someone else, feel free to share it. And if you have questions, corrections, or points of disagreement, you're welcome to leave a comment, especially where the sources are ambiguous. Thanks for watching.